In terms of Russia trying to influence the debate and the issues in South Africa, it's been pretty active on social media.
Russian war against Ukraine. First of all, it's a colonial war. Secondly, it's also a war that questions human rights. Thus, a lot of South Africans on everyday basis understand the manipulation that Russia is promoting through its narratives.
The people of South Africa very much support, underdogs or support countries that are being under attack from bigger countries. So here is a case in South Africa where the government has a different position than the people.
Hello and welcome to Ukraine in Flames, a special project by Ukraine Media Center and NGO Euro-Atlantic Course. My name is Alexandra Tsikhanowska, and today we turn our gaze to the African continent in order to understand how the Russian war against Ukraine is perceived in a region so distant, yet also heavily impacted by the consequences of the war, mostly with the food crisis. Our focus today is on the Republic of South Africa. If you want to know more, please subscribe to our channel to stay tuned. Formally, South Africa appears neutral and tries to maintain a position of neutrality regarding the Russian war against Ukraine. This neutrality, however, appears to be somewhat pro-Russian. How are we able to deduce that, and why is it so? Stephen Gruzd, head of African Governance and Diplomacy Program at the South African Institute of International Affairs, will tell us more.
South Africa's position on the Russia-Ukraine conflict is hard to sustain because it says it is strategically non-aligned and not in one camp or the other. But things like, for example, the difficulties that the Ukrainian ambassador had in trying to speak to anybody in government at a high level, and the visit of Thandi Modise, the Minister of Defense, to a defense conference in Moscow during a war shows that South Africa may not be so neutral. In terms of Russia trying to influence the debate and the issues in South Africa, it's been pretty active on social media. And I think a big blow for Russia was the pulling of RT, or Russia Today, off the DSTV satellite platform, which has meant that RT is now not being transmitted to anywhere in Africa. And I understand that Russia is trying to open a bureau in Johannesburg for RT so that it can begin broadcasting again. So I think Russia's using media channels, it's using personal visits, it's using diplomacy, and it is using its history with South Africa to try and influence the way South Africa operates and takes sides or doesn't take sides on this particular conflict.
The number of channels that Russia uses in order to solidify and strengthen its influence in South Africa is quite startling, and the prospects of opening the RT Bureau to spread Kremlin-vetted propaganda is actually really alarming. What Russian narratives influence the debate? What is the position of civic society and the general public regarding those narratives, and how do they perceive the government's position? Let's listen to Dzvinka Kachur, a fellow researcher at the Center for Sustainability Transitions at Stellenbosch University, in order to find out.
While the South African government declares itself officially neutral in the situation of Russian invasion of Ukraine, a lot of civil society organizations are not staying silent and declaring their support for Ukraine. They understand the massive humanitarian crisis that this war, that Russian invasion of Ukraine has caused, and also the impact on South Africa on multiple levels, global governance, on the increased levels of poverty, and also on the everyday life of its citizens. So, for example, Desmond and Leah Tutu Legacy Foundation have made an open statement. They are actively cooperating with Ukrainian Association of South Africa to communicate the humanitarian impact of this war on Ukraine. There are also a number of other civil society organizations that are expressing their solidarity and are calling South African government to stay with its constitution. The South African constitution has human rights in the heart of it. And the war, Russian war against Ukraine, first of all, it's a colonial war. Secondly, it's also the war that questions human rights. Thus, a lot of South Africans on everyday basis understand the manipulation that Russia is promoting through its narratives and are standing with Ukraine. Russian narratives for South African population that allow to manipulate it are based on two wounds of South African society. One is the apartheid and the struggle anti-apartheid, where the Soviet Union played an important role. Lots of African National Congress cadres were trained and studied in the Soviet Union. And while the Soviet Union includes the 15 countries, where Ukraine was one of them, that support for the anti-apartheid struggle is presented as a Russian contribution. So the narrative is that Russia has supported South Africa in a difficult time of fighting against apartheid, and South African people have to support Russia today in its fight against Ukraine. Secondly, the narrative is positioned in the anti-colonial struggle, because there was no justice. The colonial relationship between African countries and the West is very traumatic, and Russia is using this past to present itself as a country that has never colonized other countries, meaning that it's never colonized the African continent and completely disregarding the fact that it was actively colonizing its neighbors of Russian Empire. So the narrative is presented that Russia was fighting against colonial West, and today Ukraine is presented as part of colonial West, while Russia is part of the anti-colonial movement. The colonial past remains massive wound for South Africa. The levels of inequality are also very significant. South Africa remains the most unequal society according to Gini index. And using those two narratives, anti-apartheid struggle and colonial past, Russia manages to present itself as a country that fights for more equality in the world. When speaking about the position of the government, specifically South African government, President Ramaphosa has stated that the reason for the Russian invasion of Ukraine was NATO position. So this is a narrative that was officially presented, and South Africa officially remains neutral according to its votes in United Nations General Assembly and also in its statements. South African officials name Russian invasion of Ukraine as a conflict and not as war. Also, Russian Minister of Defense has visited, South African Minister of Defense has visited Russia recently. And South African position in voting on humanitarian resolution in the United Nations was also seen as representation of Russian influences. At the same time, South African constitution is based on human rights. Human rights are the basics of South African society, but that topic is completely neglected. Very often, South Africa is presented today as a possibility to be a peace builder, forgetting that Nelson Mandela's approach to peace building was first to stop the violence and secondly to start the peace talk. So currently, South African government forgets this first part, where we say stop the violence and then we can start the peace talks, and only continues to emphasizing on the need for peace talks, forgetting to call to stop the violence. Why is this position? There might be different opinions on the reasons for such position. One, as I explained before, is the deep connections with through anti-apartheid movement, but more real the connections between the previous president and his fraction within African National Congress. South Africa remains one-party dominant country, so one party is controlling the parliament and elects the president. Previous president Zuma had very close relationship with Russian President Putin. They had signed the agreement that remained uncovered for many years on construction of nuclear power stations. Currently, those business interests might be playing influence on the position of President Ramaphosa. How the life has changed in South Africa since Russian invasion of Ukraine. On an everyday basis, people can see the increased fuel prices, also increased prices for cooking oil. This would definitely contribute to the increased poverty in the country, which for South Africa is a pressing issue. The levels of unemployment in South Africa are very high, and increase of fuel is a risk for small entrepreneurs and for even that existing employment that is in the poor communities. So Russian war against Ukraine is already impacting on every level. We understand that increased poverty will lead to higher levels of gender-based violence in communities. It also might cause migration to South Africa from countries that will be facing hunger.
It is worthwhile to remember that, in addition to the previous factors, South Africa is also a member of the BRICS alliance. How exactly does it play out, and what does it mean for the South African position on the Russian war? Professor William Gumede, the School of Governance at the University of Witwatersrand and executive chairperson of Democracy Works Foundation, will tell us more.
Thank you for inviting me, and I just wish to express my support to the Ukrainian people and my sympathy and compassion for what is happening. Just to start off in terms of why the South Africa's position in relation to Russia, I think there are a number of reasons. So the first reason is South Africa is part of the BRICS alliance. So the alliance is Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. And it's not a political alliance, it's a trade alliance. So every country can have independent political positions because it's only a trade alliance, it's just a trade alliance. But sadly, in the South African context, the South African government has been much more supportive of Russia than politically than the other countries. The other countries, India and China and Brazil has been neutral, but much more independent. Brazil at the United Nations vote, that resolution that voted to condemn Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Brazil was very critical. And obviously, China and India abstained, were neutral, and South Africa was also neutral. But, the criticism, there's a lot of criticism in South Africa against our own government because we are a democracy and we've got a democratic constitution. And our democratic constitution says, the country's foreign policy must always be human rights based, must always be democratic. And we must support people who are victimized and being under attack and being oppressed. So our foreign policy so far, by supporting Russia, although the South African government says it's a neutral policy, but really by being neutral, we're really silent as a country against Russia's what Russia is doing against Ukraine. The second reason, the second issue that influenced our policy, the South African government's policy towards Russia, is the fact that many ANC members, African National Congress is a governing party in South Africa, their members were during the Cold War in the 1980s and 1970s. The old Soviet Union supported the anti-apartheid struggle and supported the ANC with finances and with material and with training. And many of the current generation of ANC leaders, the current generation in government, they went, say, to university in Russia and in Ukraine. So they also went to and so on. So many ANC members and leaders think that Russia is the Soviet Union. So people, ordinary South Africans, cannot see, particularly many Black South Africans, they can't differ between the Soviet Union and Russia. So they think that Russia of Vladimir Putin is the Russia of the Soviet Union, and therefore they think they must support Russia, because they think Russia is the Soviet Union, and because the Soviet Union supported many Black South Africans with education, and the ANC against the apartheid government, and that is why they're supportive. The third thing has been that among many ANC members are very opposed to the West, opposed to America, to the US and to Western countries, because the argument that Western countries colonize Africa, and therefore any country that opposes the West must be supported, or there has to be some sympathy for a country that fights against the West. And because the Russian government has been in its propaganda has been saying that Ukraine is part of the West, or Ukraine is a puppet government of the US and other Western countries in the European Union, and because of that, many South Africans think that well, actually that is true. And therefore, they must support Russia because the Ukraine is allegedly a puppet of Western countries. So, these are the three things that really makes it very support for Russia that we can see in the government because of these reasons. Oh, before we go to this question, I might just say there's a difference between the government and the people in South Africa. So the government may be neutral in Russia's invasions of Ukraine, or is not condemning Russia. The people are different, because the people of South Africa very much support, underdogs, or support countries that are being under attack from bigger countries. So here is a case in South Africa where the government has a different position than the people, and so on. So the government may have a view, but then I must also even tell you that even in the ANC government, there's not one view. There is, there's a lot of support within the ANC government for Ukraine. But the top leaders who make the decisions, their view is for South Africa to be neutral. So the ANC, the governing party, is actually split down the middle. There are many, many people who say, Russia's invasion of Ukraine is unacceptable. That shouldn't happen, because in Africa, the last couple of years, in the rest of Africa, the big debate on the continent has been among African countries that, African countries should not be invaded by bigger countries, or and so on. And so there is in Africa, and also among many ANC members and ordinary people in South Africa, very much an opposition against bigger countries invading smaller countries. Because, in Africa, that's often the case that a foreign country come in and invade, like in Libya. There was, US-led alliance to remove Muhammad Gaddafi, and now this is caused a big chaos, in Africa. Rise of terrorism, because now there's a rule because of the lack of rule of law, and there's no stable government in Libya anymore, and lots of migration in Africa because of that, and so on. So as Africans are very sensitive, ordinary Africans, to foreign countries, bigger countries, invading smaller countries. Because they know the suffering that it causes and the implication and the pain that it's that it causes. So, to summarize, there is, the government have a view, but the government view is not necessarily the same as the country's view. It is not necessarily the same as the people's view, who have different view to government. It is, Russia's invasion of Ukraine has directly impacted on South Africa. Firstly, just on the economy. The first thing that it has caused, because of the shortages, the rise and increase of fuel prices. South Africa is heavily dependent on importing fuel. So the price of fuel impact immediately the South African economy because we import fuel. We import oil, we import gas from abroad. So, so we've seen price increases in South Africa, so transport has gone up. And poor South Africans, for poor South Africans, transport cost is much higher in their spending than any other item, because people live far from workplaces, and so they have to travel with public transport and so on. So we've already seen that. There's a lot of economic suffering because of high food prices. The second thing is high fuel prices, but it's also been because Ukraine is a bread basket, one of the bread basket of the world. We've also seen, food price increases. It's not as much of, obviously, in South Africa as it's been in other African countries, because we also produce a lot of our own foods and we export our own food. But still, what we've seen a direct increase in food prices also in South Africa. Poor people are suffering, and you also must remember that in South Africa, after COVID-19, so the COVID-19 pandemic has caused a financial crisis in South Africa. So now the Russia war in Ukraine is causing a second financial crisis. So we have two double financial crises now. It is very hard. It's very difficult for ordinary people in the country. The third element of it is, many of South Africa's neighboring countries depend very highly on imports, wheat imports, say from Ukraine, and they are suffering. And then what happens is, because we've had high food prices in the rest of Africa and high fuel costs in the rest of Africa and economic suffering, many of other Africans come to South Africa, because that's normally what people do. If the economies, other African countries' economies are in trouble, they go either to Europe, to immigration to Europe, or they come to South Africa. So now we've got many people, Africans, who are hungry and who are suffering, coming to South Africa. So in South Africa now, they also increase the costs in South Africa, because we have now an increase in immigration to South Africa. Then, of course, in South Africa, there's also direct political implications. When I tell political now, normally in South Africa, but also in other African countries, when there is a rise in hunger, when people are hungry and the economy is very difficult, people are normally protest against governments, and normally actually when they unseat the governments, when they don't vote for governments anymore, normally during periods of hunger. So it is, it is very likely that in South Africa, that the ANC government, because of the support of Russia, and then the impact on the South African economy and on ordinary people, because, the food prices and transport the price increases, that people in the next national election will not vote for the ANC. So the Russian invasion of Ukraine could also lead to the ANC in South Africa losing power, because of all of the hardship that it has caused in South Africa. But also outside South Africa, in Africa, normally in African countries, when there is high food price increases and high fuel costs, there's often riots. So we've already seen riots in the rest of Africa, Sierra Leone, in Ghana, in Kenya, and places like that. Now, also normally what happens when we have food crises in Africa, food inflation, we also see people go against, they try to get rid of the governments. So we will see many governments will fall in Africa because of high food prices, which is directly related to Russia's war on Ukraine. But there's also another element in Africa. Normally with high food prices, what we see is is because people are dissatisfied, politically dissatisfied with government, we also see then the rise of fundamentalist movements in Africa, Islam fundamentalist movements and terrorist groups, because people become more sympathetic to these groups, because these groups then say, well, it's the government's fault. So we may see also a rise in Africa of, not in South Africa, but in Africa, a rise of fundamentalist groups, again, in Africa, which will be exported to Europe. And then also because of the hunger in Africa, we will see a rise of migration from Africa to Europe. We've seen in the last couple of years, Africans crossing because they're hunger and because they're poor and because they're unemployed, migrate to Europe to look for jobs, to look for income. People cross the Mediterranean to Europe. We are going to see a rise of that because of, Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the suffering that it is causing in Africa.
You've been watching the special project by Ukraine Media Center and NGO Euro-Atlantic Course, Ukraine in Flames. If you find our work useful, please like and share this video and don't forget to subscribe to our channel. In the description to this episode, you can find information on how you personally can help Ukraine in the face of Russian aggression. Remember that everything is going to be Ukraine.